Welcome back everyone to another 2D to 3D video. I am Follygon, and in this video I am going to show you my entire digital character sculpting process from beginning to end. Click that subscribe button if you are new around here, and wait a second. This sphere is going to take way too long to sculpt into an entire character. I have an idea. Oh, God, no. That one's no good. Oh, okay, closer, but not quite. Ah, there we go, perfect. These base mesh heads were made using my tool, ModMesh, a base head creation tool that lets you design your very own head from over 28 million possible combinations. Check it out at the link in the description. I also have some fun tutorials, my very own custom brushes, and more, all linked down below. So this time around, I am working on a beautiful female character inspired by the artwork of Lydia Elaine, at Lotus Bubble on Instagram. I'll be turning this 2D concept into 3D using my software of choice, ZBrush, created here on my Cintiq Graphics Tablet that lets me use a pen to control my digital clay. I'm starting with a base mesh of my own creation to speed up my workflow and get us past the early stages faster. But that does not mean that I do not have my work cut out for me here. Starting with a base mesh is a fantastic way to speed up your workflow. And if you are a working professional, or if you're working and creating something for a client at all, you should be using base meshes. They are going to save yourself time, they're gonna save your client money, and they're just gonna get you to a happier place a lot faster. Now, the only time I don't really recommend using a base mesh or starting from some pre-made work is when you are trying to practice and improve, or creating personal artwork. A lot of the stuff that you will see me make on my YouTube channel is made completely from scratch. I do not very often start from a base mesh. And if you've ever wondered how did Follygon get so good at sculpting, well, that's because I make pretty much everything from scratch. Even the base mesh stuff that you can see me working with right now is all stuff that I've made from scratch in the past. But typically in my videos, I like to show you guys the whole process. Here in this video, we're gonna be talking about some more advanced stuff, so I wanted to speed up past some of those earlier stages. And of course, I have to talk about some of the weird stuff going on screen right now. So I'm duplicating my base mesh body that I created a while back for another character, and I'm turning that into a jacket. It is going to look extremely weird and awkward at first, but I have to get something on my canvas to have a nice starting point. Now I'm going in and continuing to work on my face and starting to add in some color. During the early part of sculpting a character, I think getting color on your character as soon as possible, even if it's just really simple like what I'm doing here, I'm literally just sampling colors from my reference image and quickly painting that on top of my character's face. Even if it looks a little silly at first, it helps a ton with proportions and just figuring out the overall shape that you need to go for, the expression, especially getting in those eyelashes and eyebrows really help with expression. Eyes are just such an expressive part of the face, and one thing that I really focus on during this character, and one thing I'm going to be really hitting home, is some of this clothing stuff, and we're going to be getting in and talking about textures and all sorts of cool stuff with this. So getting in on that hat next, starting to extract some geometry. One thing that you'll notice I do a ton with my character work here is that I repurpose what I already have. So you saw me just take a portion of the head, duplicate it, and repurpose it into a hat rather quickly. And now I'm just throwing on some quick tubes of geometry to quickly represent some hair. ZBrush here, the software that I'm using, has this feature called Dynamesh, another feature called Sculptress Pro, which is a really organic way of working with your form. You can very quickly mush things together, combine them, cut them, separate them. It's just a really organic way to work, and it's a tool that I use in my workflow all the time. That is specifically what I used for that base of hair, which is rather messy at first, but that's kind of the point, just trying to get that basic idea down. And now you can see me going in over top of that base form and starting to create these more individual tubes or strands of hair. These are going to represent larger chunks and sections of the hair that I will split up further as I continue to work on that hair. There is a huge mess of hair for me to sculpt, and I kind of have my work cut out for me there. I was mentioning, this is not going to be an easy character. There's still a lot going on with this, even though I used a base mesh head. So stick around and I will talk about this hair a lot more as we continue forward. I mentioned that I like to take that base chunk, insert tubes over top of it, but I also like to cut sections away from that hair and repurpose that geometry. A quick base is a great way to visualize what you're creating, but not only can you use that quick base as a previs, but you can also split off chunks of form and kind of clean up and repurpose and Z-remesh, for those that are familiar, to create new and clean pieces of geometry. However, I can't just work on the hair this whole time and forget about my face and everything else, so I'm taking some time now to go back to my character's face and work on it a little more. Well, one thing that I find happens if you're working on one area, say your hair or your face, for a little too long, you get a little bit of tunnel vision and other things start to fall away or fall to the wayside, so to speak. So I like to jump around a lot. It also gives me some time to take a break from working on one particular area. If I work in one area too long, my eyes kind of get used to what I'm looking at and things kind of start to look a little more alien or awkward. So it's good to jump around a lot for a number of reasons. Speaking of jumping, I am now sculpting some shoes repurposed from, hey, a foot. I took all that geometry and just squashed it all together, combined the toes and everything there into a basic shape of a shoe. One thing you'll also notice with all the clothing and different things that I'm creating is I'm really just sculpting them kind of organically from scratch. That is a really fun exercise and something that I really enjoyed about creating this character. There are ways that you can do what is called poly modeling. This is kind of a less organic way of working, and it is definitely a viable way to go about creating clothing, especially things like shoes and jackets. However, here I worked pretty organically and quick and just mainly used my sculpting tool set to create these basic shapes, and you'll see me do a lot more here, specifically with the jacket. I'm really excited to talk about some of the sculptural aspects of those folds and larger chunky forms. Speaking of, here is some of that now on the sleeves. I am going in with really any kind of Damien Standard or Standard-esque brush. It's not really all that complicated in terms of the tool set, but taking those tools as well as pinch brushes and creating these large, just chunky folds of form. Then I like to go back over top of those with my clay brush. I am of course using my custom clay brush. If you guys are interested in my custom brushes, you can get those at the link down below in the description. However, the default brushes in ZBrush are just as viable, but if you want mine, you can grab them down below. I actually use a very similar technique between the folds of the clothing and the larger, chunkier sections of my character's hair. After I start carving in some of those forms for my hair, I start going over that process that I mentioned earlier for separating those into more pieces. When you are tackling extremely complex hair like I am here, it is good to work from large to medium to small. So I've taken that large shape that I've created flowing down her chest. I've started to separate that into 3 or 4 different pieces, and over time you'll see me start to add some more sculptural form to these chunks of hair, going in, adding details, as well as smaller pieces to help create more visual interest, specifically around the character's face. Working on hair like this can be very overwhelming. For those who have seen my 2D to 3D video of the Loesch artwork that I created, it had just about as complicated, if not even more complicated hair than this character, and it is really just about taking your time. And of course, taking breaks, deep breaths every once in a while, and just trying not to get overwhelmed by all of it. I'm now creating some texture for the hat, going in with my clay brush, as well as some different features with the clay polish menu. Clay polish by default can give you some nice, interesting organic textures, and playing around with the edge and surface settings there can give you some rather interesting results. But for the most part, in terms of texture, as you can see here, moving on to the jacket and the hood, I'm going in and adding texture really with just a minimal amount of brushes. Here I'm using my custom Sharp Soft brush, which is pretty similar to a standard brush, to go in and start adding some texture. I carve around the edge of the hood and then go back over that with a zigzag pattern, trying to just rough up that form and create a little bit of a crinkly-like feel to that edge. And I think it worked out really well. I continue, of course, to work on all of this form and try to push that to the next level while trying to get everything to feel like the appropriate material, which is a ton of fun to play around and experiment with. I like gently using trim brushes over my surface or a flat area to not just blend areas, but also create really subtle textures. So you know how I mentioned I like to jump around a lot? We're jumping back up to the face to do a little reassessment pass. This is when I like to go back in over top of my face and make sure that I don't have too many accidental areas. I want everything to be controlled and really intentional for these shapes that I'm trying to create. I don't want to leave any stone unturned, so I go back over my soft, more organic forms and begin to adjust some of the proportions and really sharpen up my edges, at least just a little bit, so that I can see where some of my major forms are turning or where my plane changes are occurring. For those that are interested in this technique and also just learning more about the major plane changes of the face, you can check out my tutorial at my Gumroad link down below. When you're working on something for a long time, some of these changes feel really subtle and like you're not really making a huge difference, but I promise that those little changes add up really quickly. Back to the hair, working on the back side of it, I have to kind of make up a little bit of this information, and all I really have to go off for this character is that singular image of the front side. So I have to be a little creative back here, using some of the shape language that I can see from the front to, in general, just design some of the shape language that we can see for the back of the head. After just a little more on the hair, it is time to move on to posing. Now, I have already broken symmetry on a few aspects of this character, but I wanted to go ahead and complete that cycle, start to pose and turn the character's head off to the side, and start to work on generally just getting the overall feel down for that pose, get the proportions maybe a little closer to my reference image, which you can see I'm doing by overlaying that over top. A lot of the stuff in 2D doesn't often translate perfectly to 3D, just because of perspective and how things work in a three-dimensional space. So there are some things that are cheated or always going to be cheated in a 2D image. It is our job as the 3D artist to make as much sense from that as we can and push that to be as good as possible. Now, of course, after you pose and break symmetry, it often breaks a lot of the forms that you have already sculpted. Here on the legs of the character, I had a lot of these kind of holdover forms, is what I like to call them. Essentially, stuff from the blockout or early stage of sculpting, where I still have a lot of those hard edges. So I need to go back in, re-sculpt over top of these forms, start to make things feel more soft and organic. She is a human character, not a robot, so I need to go back over those and start to make them feel a little more lifelike. But I will say I do like me some sharp edges. If you guys have ever seen any of my characters, I'm definitely a big fan of that generally sharp stylized feel. So of course I incorporate some of that shape language into this character. This jacket was just such a fun experience to create. I don't normally create clothing quite the way I'm doing it here, but I was in, I guess, just a really sculptural mood where I wanted to get in and get messy with a lot of these forms, which is exactly what I am doing right now. I am not going in and using these inorganic poly modeling tools. Instead, I am just carving directly into my surface, letting kind of whatever happens happen here. And I am absolutely okay with things getting messy because I know that they are inevitably going to get messy, but it really helped to sell the organic feel of this jacket, and it actually gave me a lot of opportunity for what Bob Ross might call some happy accidents. Normally, happy accidents in your artwork are, in my experience, few and far between, more often accidental than happy, but here, by embracing that organic sculptural side of things, I definitely had a lot more opportunities for happy from these forms rather than just plain old accidents that I needed to go back in and fix. I wouldn't really recommend going in and sculpting your clothing this way unless you have a lot of experience sculpting organic forms. It can be very difficult to control, but some of the benefits of that are really nice in terms of the final organic results that you can get from those forms. Speaking of organic forms, the chest of this character was feeling extremely lopsided and awkward, so I just needed to go back in there and do a reassessment pass very similar to what I did on my character's face. So going back in, cleaning up some of those forms, as I love to say here, it is never too late to go back and fix some of your early mistakes. Continuing to add in some secondary forms and details to this clothing, working on those jacket sleeves even more, starting to create this seam line. There are a lot of seam brushes and different cool custom brushes that you can get out there, but just really taking the time to hand sculpt something like this from scratch can be a really good exercise, great practice, and a really fun way to just see what you can come up with the most simple of tools. Now, if this were one of my other videos where I was sculpting my character from scratch and I didn't have a base mesh to speed things up, we might just now be getting to the clothing. But because I was able to speed things up, I was able to spend a lot more time than I normally would creating my clothing and making it feel as good as possible. And the hair, which is really important because this character is mostly clothing and hair, mostly a big old thick jacket and hair. There's a lot going on up there, but there's also a lot going on down here with this character's shoes. And they were feeling way too much like some bowling shoes, golf shoes. Not anything stylish or anything I felt representative of my reference. Although the reference is extremely painterly, I guess is what I might call it, it's very interpretational, where it is clearly meant to be some kind of sneaker, but in terms of, directly representing that form, they are not extremely well defined. So I had to kind of come up with my own design. What I did for that was just look up some references. I think of some Nike sneakers. I pulled from a bunch of different styles, it's some Adidas, just whatever I could find on some shopping websites. Shopping websites, by the way, great place to get some references for clothing because they will often show the shoes or article of clothing from many different angles, giving you some really fantastic references. So I would highly encourage you to check out some shopping websites and maybe set your wallet off to the side while you do that so you don't get too distracted. But moving on to some more hair, I mentioned we start with the big, then the kind of medium shapes, and now I'm getting in and working on those tertiary shapes or those more detailed forms here with the hair. Specifically on this chunk, you can kind of see how that big shape is still represented, right? We can still see that big silhouette. We can see those, in-between shapes and how those chunks are split up into smaller forms. And now you can see the texture or sculptural form that I'm adding on top of the surface. Then I'm going back in, of course, always looking for opportunities to create more fine, tiny pieces of hair, little details, little things to draw your attention to specific areas where I want your focus. I worked on this big chunk, this kind of cool curly Q shape towards the bottom for a while, so I wanted to draw some particular or special attention to that area, so a little more detail in that area, a little less in others can help lead the eye specifically to where you want your audience to focus. For the most part though, I would say try to keep those to a minimum and try to lead your audience towards your character's face. That is the moneymaker, the most important part of your character, or at least typically, depending on what you're going for, but at least in this case, you can see that I have most of those smaller, tinier pieces up towards the character's eyes. And if you are interested in learning more about sculpting hair, of course, check out the links below as I've already mentioned. In particular, I will say recently on my Patreon, I released a really fantastic tutorial on sculpting a number of different short, medium, and long hairstyles. But hair like this is never really finished. As we say with artwork, it is never finished, only abandoned, and that is definitely the case when we are talking about hair that is this complicated. You could, of course, simulate something like this, but you wouldn't get the same exact feel or style, in my opinion. I am more a fan of sculpting my hair. As you can see with pretty much all of my characters, I handle it in a very similar technique. I really love the general chunky style that we can get from that, and I also really love the ability that you get to kind of control specific details and bring attention to specific areas, as I've already mentioned. Now you can see me taking advantage of that benefit of being posed and having that head tilted off to the side. I can still go back in and make some changes to that proportionally without taking up a huge amount of my time. The face is relatively simple, so I can start to push that and get that as close to my reference as possible. And by having that leaning and twisted in the direction that it already needs to be in for the final character, it makes referencing Lotus Bubble's artwork a whole lot easier. If you have ever tried to create a character in a neutral pose based off of a posed artwork, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm using a lot of masking here on the face. This is the dark paint that you can see me quickly applying to different areas of the face. That allows me to quickly select certain areas so I don't affect them if there's something I don't want to mess up or endanger while I am working. Masks are a fantastic thing to add to your toolset, and it's something that I use all the time while I am sculpting. You can also use it to select specific or individual areas like the mouth and maybe slide it down or make any kind of proportional change that you would like. At this stage, I would say that the character is pretty much finished, but it is time to go into the stage of polish or finishing touches. And in some ways, it is the most important part of the process. I love to talk about the early stages and block out and primary form, but at the same time, the small amounts of polish that you add to the end of a character are just as important. It's the difference between making a plain vanilla cake with no icing or anything else and actually adding icing at the end and decoration and making your cake look beautiful. Of course, it's still a cake, sure, but it really needs that icing to be visually interesting and to, feel finished. A cake without icing, doesn't really make too much sense. I don't know. The analogy's getting away from me, but I think you kind of understand what I am saying. The end stages of character creation are extremely important. So I'm going in and making sure that there's nothing that I'm forgetting about, all these small little pieces. Of course, going back in to create the character's purse, which I had totally not forgotten about. I did remember that she had a purse and did not forget it at all. Okay, I might have forgot it a little bit, but that is not extremely important. What is important is that I did create the purse, okay? I did make it at the end. And luckily it wasn't too tough. I did create it very sculpturally. I was on Kick organically sculpting with the jacket, so I figured, hey, I'll make the purse in a really similar way, just kind of grab a cube and start kind of sculpting on top of that, of course, using some remeshing and cleanup tools to very quickly make that feel a little less messy. Same thing up top with the hat, kind of cleaning some of that form up, as well as adding in these little tiny chunks of hair. One thing I really love to do is check on my character by taking some screenshots and maybe looking at them on my phone or something like that. It can be a great way to just quickly get some perspective, and I was noticing that the silhouette of my character's hair in the back was kind of flat and boring, so I added in a few extra little pieces of hair here and there to help visually improve my character's silhouette. A couple more details around the face to help create a little section of lower eyelash. Obviously, this makes little sense to anatomically what we would expect in this area, especially where I am placing it, but in terms of a graphical shape, I've had a lot of success with this technique in the past, and I like to do this on pretty much any character that I create that has enough dark contrast or more of a cat eye eyelash for the outside corner of their eye. My character was looking a little too short proportionally. The jacket is extremely thick and poofy, and that kind of throws off the proportions a little more than I was hoping, so I intentionally made her a little taller than what she actually needed to be just by measuring proportions, and I think that helped the overall proportion of the upper body feel not quite as large. What is the point of being a sculptor if you're not going to sculpt a butt, right? We're doing our second pass back here to just clean up some form and make sure that things feel and make as much sense as possible. We're not going to have a lot of hard edges back here if she is wearing spandex, so going back in and correcting some of those awkward areas, and then of course finishing up with one last pass up here towards the head. I was noticing that the proportions and overall thickness for the back of the head, the hair, and the hat were feeling really shallow and making her head feel really tiny. So I went back in, thickened some of that up, and gave that one last pass to push that into a really good spot. And after the smallest of final touches and little tweaks here at the end, I send everything over to Blender for rendering. And as many of you know by now, I am sure it is time for that part that so many skip to, the final renders. Hello, my dearest skipper friends, glad to see you here at the end of the video, but hey, if you like what you see, I think you'll also really enjoy learning more about the process of how I made this character. Consider going back through and giving it a watch if you did just so happen to skip here to the end of the video. Yeah, I know, I got you again. But hey, no hard feelings either way. I appreciate your interest in my art. And if you would like to learn more about digital sculpting, check out the links below in the description. My Gumroad is where you can find all of my tutorials and my custom brushes. The Appeal Academy is my online program that includes an ever-expanding massive library of videos on every single thing I know about creating appealing characters. And if you're not quite ready for that leap just yet, I recommend checking out my Patreon. And as I love to say here at the end, of course, this video is not free. You do have to pay up, and you can do that if you are new around here by clicking that subscribe button. And if you're a longtime fan of the channel and enjoyed the video, click that like button. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.